let's try this again. I think I'm ready to go. I'm sorry about the struggles of all this stuff. So thank you for being gracious with me. My wife is working this morning. She works in the ICU at Littleton, and so she got called in on Sunday, and so I'm here with 2 boys by myself. So, anyways, normally she'd be here to take care of the boys, and I can take care of the classes. We're a pretty good team that way. I'm a really bad team by myself. Turns out there is no I in team. But my name's Robert. Just a couple things about myself. Currently a math teacher at Heritage High School. So just so you can know a little bit about me, I have a degree in mathematics, a degree in youth ministry, and a degree in education. So lots of education and all that stuff. Some other really fun facts. I was a finalist for Teacher of the Year 3 years ago. I've written a novel, and I'm now working part-time for a construction company. If anybody needs to remodel their house, let me know. Okay, so I've got all kinds of crazy stuff going on. But that's kind of a little bit about me. I'll tell you more about myself later, but anybody want to share something like what interested you about this class? Why'd you come here?
Robert?
Oh, yes.
I came because I did it the first time, and there was so much information.
Okay.
And my brain could not hang on to it.
Okay.
And I said, I need to redo.
I had the same feeling.
Yeah. But it's so amazing what you're going to...
Well, thank you. That's a good sign if you've been here before and you trusted me enough to come back.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that. Somebody else? Anybody here for the first time?
Oh my gosh, are we all repeats? Oh.
Yes. Okay. Tell me why you're here.
Oh, because I have so many questions.
You have so many questions. Fantastic. I actually really love questions. In fact, I would encourage them. A lot of people have friends in the workplace that might ask you questions. You can even bring them. I really love it when we have people that aren't Christians come to this class. We usually have a few, and they ask great questions. And I think we can all sharpen each other a little bit on that. So I really encourage them. Don't hesitate. If you're nervous about asking them during class, again, if anybody is uncomfortable about me recording you, feel free to just let me know afterwards, and I'll edit out any question that you want. But I really do encourage questions, whether that's email or anything else. Anybody else? Share why you're here today.
I missed your class before because when Barb and I came to church together, she always wanted to go to first service, so we always missed connecting hour.
Okay.
So I've decided to.
So you're just going to skip church and then come here?
Well, I will go to church too.
That's great.
It just makes a long day, but I have time.
Yeah. That's all right. I don't remember what that's like, so maybe you can fill
Well,
me
you
in.
can see how things go.
Yeah, for sure.
You're too young.
You saying that I look young is a very high compliment to me. Most people think I look about 70. I'm
Oh,
not.
no.
I'm not a day over 69. Okay, so anyways.
Teachers just get early gray hair.
Oh, you have no idea.
Teachers and presidents.
Youth pastors too. I was one of those for a
Yes.
while. I was a youth pastor for 4.5 years. Anyway, so this is, and I'll tell you my story a little bit later, but kind of what I want to talk about is kind of our purpose for this class a little bit. This is kind of an intro class. We will talk about some of the science stuff, but I want to talk about what we're doing here, because I think this is the kind of the perception of what people think of faith or religion. It's and I think it's really sad. I think a lot of people have the wrong idea, and I'm going to try to go right into the middle of that conflict, where we have on one side kind of our ideas of faith, and obviously nobody here is thinking about faith in this way. But I'm hoping to bridge in some ways the perception of what faith really is. Because there's a lot of, this is kind of fuzzy, sorry, certain things. Hey Nick, come on in buddy. So, I don't know if you could read this. It says, when you say I'm a Christian, what I hear is, I was raised by Christian parents that have blind faith in a fairy tale that was written by people long ago in a book I had never fully read. By the end of this class, I hope that nobody is in that situation. I want you to understand a different reason why you might believe. I'm going to challenge some of you in maybe your perceptions. I'm going to ask you to think in a way that may be uncomfortable at times. And I would ask the same of someone who's a non-Christian. I want us to really look hard at real life data. I'm not going to be pulling any punches. Okay? This is another good one. I don't want you to be this person after this class. To most Christians, the Bible is like a software license. Nobody actually reads it. They just scroll to the bottom and click, I agree. Okay? I don't want our faith to be that way. Okay? I really don't. And so what I'm hoping in this class is that we can understand why we believe. And that we can ask the good questions, not hide from them. I think God is big enough to answer our questions. And there's some funnier ones. Creationism, because it's easier to read one book than a bunch of hard ones. I just thought the picture was funny. Okay? I think it's the last one. This is an old TV show. For those of you who are older than 20, you might remember it. House. Yeah, I'd love to talk with House sometime. So, anyway, I think there is a biblical basis for apologetics. That's the idea that we're going to be talking about here. Apologetics simply means reasons for the things that you believe. We're not apologizing for anything. What we're doing is we're saying, actually, we do have a good reason. It's not that we believe the Bible because the Bible says so. It's not, I believe in God because my parents told me to. That we actually have really good grounded reasons for the faith that we have. And so I think there really, even in the Bible, there's indications about this. So let me take a look at Romans here. I can read this for you if you want. So what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. This passage says is that we should be able to see God in the world. He's left his fingerprints everywhere. And that God is going to say, look, you should be able to look at the world and see me. I'm not hidden. Okay, and that's what the Bible says. When we are looking at evidence for belief, we should be thinking about that. Here's another good one, a little bit more poetic. This is from Psalms. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. I love this one. Where you just can look around the world and you see God screaming at us. You look up at the night sky and knowledge pours forth. In fact, we're going to start this class by looking at the sky and the stars and looking at what that says. So I think this is in the Bible too. Our faith requires of us that we can look at this and see. And if you're watching this or you're here and faith is a little confusing or a little makes you nervous, maybe you don't believe yet, know that that's okay too. Christians and non-Christians both can look at the same set of data and come to the same conclusions. And that's what I'm hoping we'll do here. Okay? So here's just a basic perspectives of this course. I want to let you know kind of what you're getting into before we jump too far in, because we are going to get pretty deep in here. So I believe that God and science go together. Okay, it's not one or the other. That's exactly the symbol that I would use too. Okay, that's great. Okay, God and science go together. The idea somehow in secular culture is that faith is sort of antithetical to science. Antithetical meaning like the exact opposite of. I don't think that's the case at all. I think if our faith is true and God really made the world, we should see him everywhere. When we look in science, science should be preaching God's glory just as much as the Bible does. And so I think they go together. They are not in conflict. And if there are situations where they seem to be in conflict, there may be a resolution that we haven't understood yet. Maybe there's more information, or maybe we're reading the scriptures wrong. Maybe we're understanding the science wrong. Okay? So a great example of that is from Genesis. I think there's this idea that a lot of Christians believe that the world has to be 6,006 years old, or I guess it's up to 6,010 years old or something. Okay? And science seems to suggest that the Earth is 4 billion years old, and the universe is 13.8 billion years old. Those are actually really different numbers. As a math teacher, I know that's probably some really deep insight, but 6,000 and almost 14 billion are different. Okay? Yeah, we use this symbol in math. That is not equal to... All right, we got it. Those are not the same. And so the question is, how do we resolve that conflict? Is the Bible wrong? Is science wrong? Should they be fighting with each other? And I don't think that they are in conflict at all. In fact, most biblical scholars before about the 1200s never saw any conflict. They didn't see that the earth was 6,000 years old. There was a pope or a bishop, I can't remember, I'll give you the details on that later, who decided to try to work backwards from the genealogies and come up with an exact date of the earth's formation. But I think it's just a really bad reading of Genesis. There are multiple different ways of reading Genesis, and one is a literal science textbook. If you guys got your Bibles here, I don't know if you'd want to open up to Genesis 1, where it talks about the 6-day creation. But if you read that, and it reads like a textbook, I think you're reading it wrong. It screams poetry. Okay, so if you've got your Bibles there, you can take a look. Do you want to read the very first 2 verses? Do you have it? Let's read it. I'd love to hear it.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters.
Oh man, that's beautiful. He didn't define his terms very well, though. I don't see a lot of definitions in there. Genesis isn't a science book. It's metaphor, it's poetry, it's explaining the glory of God, which honestly, poetry is the best vehicle, literarily, that you can use to describe magnificence of something like God. In fact, there are multiple different versions of the word day just in that first chapter. The Hebrew word is yom, and if we look in there, we see all these different kinds of days. In fact, the first word day, we don't translate as day at the beginning, but in the beginning, we see this time is happening before even the first day. The first day hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened until the next verse. What's verse 3?
Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light.
Yes. And there was evening and there was morning. It was the first day. First day doesn't even happen until God is already there's already all this stuff. Right? So, to think of creation as this 6-day specific 24-hour event, I think is just a really bad reading of English and literature rather than a science question for us. And the Hebrews didn't understand Yom being a specific 24-hour day or a 12-hour day. They understood it much bigger than that. And we can continue to read. And some of them don't even make sense to do in a day. For example, on the 6th day, Adam's naming all the animals. Can you imagine naming all the animals in a day? We can see he got kind of tired towards the end. You know, he starts out, he's like, oh man, there's rhinoceros, yes. Right? Giraffe. And by the end of the day, he's like, ox. Cat. Right? You kind of see that this Adam's getting tired here. This is not something that Adam could have done in a day. And so again, Hebrews would not have understood this, and the fact that we're trying to cram our literal understanding of something that was never meant to be understood literally creates this conflict. And there shouldn't be one. Again, to understand that God is bigger than our ideas, that somehow poetry is actually the best way of describing Him, is a much better way of understanding Genesis and is much more in line with what the Hebrews would have understood it. It wasn't until they translated this into English, or the precursors to English, as in Latin and early English, that we started thinking of this day as meaning only a literal 24-hour period. So I think that that's where the conflict happens. And so I'm not going to be taking a look at this as in that we have a 6,000-year-old Earth. I think that the Earth is 4 billion something years old. I think the universe is 13.8. I don't see any conflict with that in Genesis. And again, if that's not your perspective, I think there actually are some good reasons to think about the world being 6,000 years old. There are a couple of scientific arguments I find somewhat compelling. I'd be happy to talk about those with you. But ultimately, I think that if we decide to believe in a very early Earth called young Earth creationism, we're forced into a very difficult view of God. Except it forces us to assume that God made the universe appear older than it actually is. Meaning that God would have to be deceptive. And I don't think the Christian worldview actually supports a deceptive God. And so I think that there's a lot of challenges theologically from believing in young Earth, and that's the biggest one for me. So if you do have that perspective, that's fine. I don't think you're going to hell or something. There's a lot of ability for us to come together, I think, in faith and ask good questions, and I'm happy to dialogue with any of you on this stuff. If you see a disagreement or you want to point out a flaw in my argument, I would love to chat with you about that. What we're going to be looking at is a concept called intelligent design, particularly early in this course. Intelligent design, essentially, we're going to be looking at the idea that, okay, maybe we can't necessarily tell who God is right away, but we can tell there is a God. Something purposeful, something intelligent created the world, designed the world, created it for a purpose. And what we're going to do is we're start out very general. Say, is there a God or is there not?
Yes, there is.
Okay? And then we're going to become more specific. What can we determine from nature and science about this creator? And we're going to go even farther. Is there anything in history that perhaps indicates his direct involvement? And so we're going to start from very general and get more and more specific. The basic reasoning we'll be looking at is a theory called intelligent design. You've heard of it before. A lot of this stuff is going to align there. Okay? And I believe questions are encouraged. If God's real, he is plenty big enough to handle your questions. All right? And so I believe that the truth will come out. All right? Yes?
I have a statement I want to say.
I would love it.
It's because nature is so perfect. And creation is so perfect. And when Jesus came, he brought the love to us in a way that we could make a difference to one, to another. And when he died and rose again, he connected us with the Creator.
Absolutely. I think class is done. Thank you. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. So I think sometimes when we talk about Jesus, we forget the middle part of this phrase. And the way, the truth, and the life. I think truth is God's truth. I think it all lines up together. And no one comes to the Father except through me is the rest of this verse here. But sometimes I think as Christians we forget the truth, and that truth is things that are true are things that line up with God. Jesus is the truth, so again, we shouldn't be afraid of those things. I want to talk a little bit about how we can argue this way, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in Christian circles about how, like, a proper way to think about how we can even look for evidence and actually point correctly to God. I think there's a lot of things that we do that are really wrong. So we can look for positive indicators for God. Let me give you a couple examples and negative examples for this. Okay? If we see intelligence and design in nature. Okay, so for example, we dig in a cave and suddenly we discovered like a literal, like written out blueprint for a bacteria. And it's like, thousands and thousands of years old. You're like, whoa, you saying somebody made bacteria? like created like from scratch. Or maybe you see, cloud writing in the sky. It's like, it just like appears one day and you're like, I am here, God. And you don't see any like one of those Skywriter planes, you're just like, whoa, that's weird. So this would be one indication that God exists. Believe it or not, we're actually going to see this exact thing in this class. Okay, not necessarily cloud writing, but that, like direct, obvious evidence of God's existence. That is there. It is in fact in some very obvious places you wouldn't think to look for it. Okay, you can also find God if all naturalistic explanations can be ruled out. Naturalism is simply the idea that the only valid argument is one of chance, is one way, so something happened by accident, or some sort of natural law forced it to happen. Okay, so for example, we wouldn't say like, oh, the Earth is so like perfectly rotating around the sun. Like that's not necessarily like a design argument, because gravity is a force that holds the Earth in place. Does that make sense? Random chance, like if you see, I flip a coin a few times in a row, and it's heads 3 times in a row. Is that a trick coin? Was I doing that on purpose? Well, maybe, but not necessarily, right? You could very easily see 5 heads in a row, or 3 heads in a row. Even 7 heads in a row actually happens with more regularity than you'd expect mathematically. But if I flipped it 50 times in a row, you start to maybe ask some questions. Maybe that coin isn't right. Maybe somebody did that on purpose. Okay, so if you can rule out something like chance or natural forces, you can rule out both of those, then we can start concluding that maybe something created this. Okay? This is the argument that a lot of Christians use. We don't understand something, therefore God did it. It's a really bad argument. And we're not going to use that argument. If you see me making that argument, call me out. Okay? It actually bothers me when Christians do this because it makes us look like all those memes at the beginning. Okay? You can't just say something that has low probability is going to be rare. So this is a good one from Richard Dawkins. And this is exactly the perspective that he takes and that I want to avoid in this class. So he says from the book, The God Delusion, which is a terrible book, you should definitely read it. No, seriously. If you have to challenge your own, ideas. Take the best arguments from the opposite perspective and challenge them, particularly something as important as faith. But here's what he says. If you don't understand how something works, never mind. Just give up and say God did it. Don't know how the nerve impulse works? Good. And you don't understand how memories lay down in the brain? Excellent. Photosynthesis is bafflingly complex process? Wonderful. Please don't go to work on the problem. Just give up and appeal to God. Okay? We're not going to do that in this class. Okay? We're not going to say, oh, this doesn't make sense, or this is low probability, therefore God did it. Those are terrible arguments, and we're not going to use them. And I want to challenge you to not think that way. Okay? Though, interestingly enough, we will talk about photosynthesis in detail, because I think it's fascinating, and I think it absolutely points towards God. But Richard Dawkins doesn't see it that way. Okay? Richard Dawkins is a great example of someone who doesn't analyze his own perspective. He's a very smart man, but he really, really likes being right. He doesn't care about truth. He cares about being right. And unfortunately, we've lost that in our society. We all want to be right. We want to be right politically, we want to be right religiously, we want to be right socially, and we never look at the best arguments from the opposite perspectives, which is how really smart people can make really wrong conclusions, because their purpose is to be right rather than to know the truth. And my purpose in this class is for us to look at the best arguments from both sides and see which one makes sense. Okay? Here's some examples of good reasoning, just so you can see it. Talked about it a little bit, but low probability actually is not a very good reason to assume that God did something. Low probability things happen a ton of times. Okay? They actually do. Exceptionally low. How many of you have played cards lately? Anybody played poker or something like that? Bridge? Euchre? Anything? Okay. Do you know what a deck of cards is?
Yeah.
Okay, good. You're good there. Okay, there are 52 cards in the deck, all different. If you shuffle a deck, and this is a crazy fact, and we'll look at the math of this later on time today. If you shuffle a deck 7 times, like a ripple shuffle, you can be confident, in fact almost certain, that particular order, like if you were to look at all the orders, oh, I got ace, and then a 7 of clubs, and then I got a jack of hearts. If you look at the exact order of those 52 cards, you can be confident, almost certain, that that arrangement of the deck of cards has never before happened in all of human history. It's a very, very low chance that you would ever get it. We'll look at the math of it later. I promise. I'm a math teacher. I promise I will also try to make it as accessible as possible. For those of you who see math and hear the word math, and you imagine that the bad dream you had in high school, the fractions chasing you down the hallway with an axe. Okay, I'm going to try my best to make math accessible for us. But again, if you shuffle a deck of cards and you look at that, the probability is so low that you can be confident that arrangement of a deck of cards has never before happened in all of human history. It's almost certain that it hasn't. Some of you are like, wait, really? Yes, it's incredibly low probability. In fact, you can go home and do something that is so unlikely. You can just do it if you want. Go take out a coin today and flip it. Flip it 50 times and write out every one. Heads or tails, heads or tails, heads or tails. Okay? The probability is really simple. Okay? You multiply probabilities together. So if you have the odds of getting a head, that's 1/2. So you can look at the probability of whatever arrangement you have and multiply those all together. Okay? Now if I multiply 3 heads together, when you multiply fractions, multiply the top number, the numerator together, and the denominator together. So 2 times 2 times 2. Whatever arrangement you get, you only have a 1 in 8 chance of having that happen with 3 flips. Okay? And every time you flip another coin, you add another 1/2 to it. By the time you get to 50, you can be confident that that arrangement of heads and tails has never before been flipped in the history of humanity. Okay? These are super low probability events. Did God design the arrangement of your deck of cards? Did he arrange the flipping of the coin? No. Okay? So, low probability actually has nothing to do with God. Well, not nothing, but it does, by itself, is not a good argument. Okay? Here's another, like if you look at the arrangement of this mountain, the specific location of the trees, you're like, man, that's beautiful. There's a really low odds of all those trees just happening to grow in those places. Way less than the ordering a deck of cards. Fantastically low probability. Just because it's low probability doesn't mean that God did it. However, if you happen to see a rock at the top of that mountain with an inscription on it that said, hey, by the way, I was here, and nobody else has ever been to that mountain, you can definitely assume that somebody was there and did it. Okay? So what I can assume here, maybe God didn't do this, but I know some person put that rock there. It says Mount Princeton. Okay? Elevation 14,197 feet. Would not recommend climbing Mount Princeton. The last 600 feet is all giant boulders. It's not particularly pleasant to climb. But when I got to the top, I saw this up there and I was like, nah, it was totally an accident. The wind eroded the stone into these specific letters. It totally is definitely chance. Okay, now this is like seeing a rock with that arrangement of wind erosion would be very low probability. Okay? But when I see a purpose behind it and low probability, I can safely conclude that someone made this. Okay? Now what we're going to be looking for is something that we can also rule out that humans didn't do, because humans can create things as well. All right? So I'm pretty sure that a human did this. But if I found this, like, I don't know, on Mars, that'd be a really interesting question. Who put it there? Because it wasn't humans. Right? So, you see what I'm saying about good and bad reasoning? Okay? This is a great example of reasoning. I just think it's funny. It says, if there is no God, how come the world fits so perfectly into a chicken? And if you notice, those are all the continents and parts of the earth rearranged to look like a chicken. It says, checkmate, atheist. I don't know who put that together. It was really creative and I thought it was funny. Also does not imply that God created the earth. But it is does imply that humans are very creative. Okay?
It's cute.
I would say a little bit about my story and why you should care about what I have to say. Here's me. Tim, you can laugh. It's okay. I intentionally picked like the worst picture I could find myself. Okay? Yeah, that's me in 8th grade. Unfortunately, I've gone downhill from there. So, where's this beard? It's shaved off. So anyway, I grew up in a church, and I went to an incredibly secular high school. I grew up in the Bay Area of California. Every single one of my teachers derided religion of all kinds. All of my friends made fun of anyone who might be a Christian. And I found myself in these two worlds. One was like the church that my parents brought me up in, and the other was the school that I went to every day. Here's a picture of my high school sign. I went to College Park High School in Pleasant Hill. Falcons, purple and white. Let's fight. Actually didn't like my high school very much. But I found myself in conflicts. These two worlds were colliding all the time. And I hated the dichotomy in myself, where I'd be at church or at home, and it was God, Jesus, everything, and then I'd be at school, and it's like, anybody who believes that is the biggest and most incredible, incompetent moron that could have ever lived. And I hated that conflict in myself, because I found myself not believing the faith of my parents. I saw all of these reasons that my science teachers would be talking about, my English teachers would be talking about, and I'm like, oh, well, we've got all these reasons. Like, look at evolution. God didn't create stuff; it evolved. And you can look at all this stuff, and I began believing this, but I wasn't quite able to resolve it. So, and I didn't really tell anybody about this. I was, my rebellion wasn't in like, oh, I was out partying on the weekends. My rebellion was I would be in the library researching which is true, atheism or Christianity. I knew they couldn't both be true, and that's what I believed somehow at the same time. And so for months, in my free time, I would be going and studying all of these scientific things because my idea was, if God's real, I should be able to see Him on this earth. I should be able to see His fingerprints. If He created stuff, we should be able to see it. It should be obvious. So I went and actually studied all the things that my science teachers were talking about, and all the things my English teachers were preaching to me. And I tried to decide, okay, which one's true? I need to either prove God doesn't exist or that He does. And so this is way back in the day. We didn't have the internet at the time. So this is a big source of research for me at home. This is Microsoft Encarta. Anybody remember the Encarta encyclopedia? Mm-hmm. Windows 95? Mm-hmm. All right. So I was studying encyclopedias. I was going to the library and reading research articles. I might be the only person you ever know who became a Christian from reading the encyclopedia. Okay? But the conclusion I came to was inescapable. God had to exist. And it wasn't an overnight conversion to Christianity. It was months more of studying and research. And I finally came to the conclusion that Christ had to exist. And ended up having a very personal experience with God. So not only did I see Jesus in history and nature and God's fingerprints everywhere, but I also had the opportunity to meet Him and give my life to Christ. So again, my story is one of, like, oh my gosh, I actually literally became a Christian by reading the encyclopedia. I think it's that obvious. And that's what I'm going to try to walk you through. Not necessarily the story that I went through exactly, but the same process. Where we're going to look at the best arguments for Christianity, the best arguments against Christianity, and see which one wins out. All right? And I challenge you in whatever perspectives you have, whether it's faith or politics or anything else, challenge that with the best arguments from the other side. Okay? So we're going to do a quick short lesson here. We're going to talk about the Big Bang. Raise your hand out there, who knows about the Big Bang? What are you doing? Okay? Tell me what you know about the Big Bang. I want to hear. Anybody else?
It's the start of the universe.
Great. Excellent. That is correct. Okay? And so we're going to talk about the Big Bang today. And there's, in terms of how the universe, like the question is, like, why is there stuff here? This is a really good question. Why are we in a room? Why are we on a planet? Why is there space and stars and stuff? Like, why do we see anything instead of why is there nothing? And there's really only two possibilities. The first possibility is that God exists, or God doesn't exist, okay? And seeing all this stuff everywhere can help us answer that question. So there's a possibility, if God exists, then the universe had a beginning. It started. Something made this stuff. Right? The other possibility is that God doesn't exist, which would mean that the universe didn't have a beginning. Now that might bother some of you to think of something not having a beginning. Does that bother anybody? Like the possibility of something not having a beginning. And because you all, if you're a Christian, you already believe that. Because God doesn't have a beginning. We don't have to explain God's existence because He's always been there. And that sounds weird, but if the universe instead didn't have a beginning, we wouldn't have to explain the existence of the universe either. Okay? And we actually have a really good reason for this in math. Here's a picture of the number line. I reference it every day in my math class. Anybody know what's on the left side of this arrow?
Infinity.
Close.
Negative infinity.
Yes! Negative infinity, okay? What's on the right side?
Infinity.
Where does the number line start?
What kind of infinity?
Negative.
Negative infinity. So we'll write it out. You get all your numbers this way. Start at 0, like go this way. If I get all the way to the end of the number line, it's negative infinity. Okay? You get all the way to the right side, and it's positive infinity. Where does the number line start? What's the first number on the number line?
0.
No.
But there's -1. That's the left of it. That's -2 and -3. I wrote all the way to -5 on this one. Okay? You got a question?
My hair starts at negative infinity.
Yeah, but infinity isn't a number. It's not a place.
Never starts.
That's the right answer. The number line doesn't have a beginning and doesn't have an end. We don't have to explain the first number. We sort of understand numbers never start, never end. They're always continuous and forever. And we can talk about this in a math class, so hopefully we can talk about it in a church or a science class. But you can actually, so if we talk about the universe in the same way, if the universe is essentially this number line, we don't have to explain where it began because it's always been here. Which means it didn't need a creator, which means we don't need a God. Does that make sense? Or it did have a beginning. Which means if it had a beginning, then someone had to put it here, or something had to put it here, which means that's a strong evidence for there being a God. Or something that is outside the universe, because I couldn't have, like, I'm a person, I can't create a universe. Something within a universe can't create it. Something outside of the universe would have to have created it if it had a beginning. Which that thing outside is sort of how we think of God. He's not bound by our universe. He's outside and eternal and all these sorts of things that we talk about.
Can you go back a slide?
Yeah,
I got a question for you.
love it.
Maybe it's just my understanding.
Sure,
So you said if God doesn't exist, the universe didn't have a beginning.
correct.
Okay, but earlier you defined that the universe is 13,800,000,000 years old,
Correct,
right?
correct,
Insinuating there is a beginning,
correct.
Yeah.
right? But I guess my issue is non-believers, come up with the Big Bang
Correct.
theory. But that's their belief of where the universe started. There was just this big bang.
Yes. It's more complicated than that, and we're going to delve into and their best arguments against this next week. Because it isn't quite that simple. Again, I'll explain that next week. We're going to talk about something called cosmic inflation, which is their best answer to why the universe still didn't need a beginning, even if it had a beginning. And we'll talk about what that means. I think it's not the greatest argument, and we'll talk about that too. But I will let you make your own decision, because I'm going to give you the best argument against God and the best argument for God, and you guys can decide. All right, again, that's going to be my philosophy. So, great question, thank you. Because you're absolutely right, because here's the problem. As far as we can tell, the universe did have a beginning. And as I've mentioned already, we're pretty sure the universe is about 13.8 billion years old, and we'll get light and determine that. So essentially what happened, anybody heard of Edwin Hubble? Okay, of the Hubble Telescope, this same guy. He, a long time ago, it was early 1900s, was looking at stars and measuring them and looking at all this stuff. He's the guy who discovered there was actually other galaxies than our own. And we originally thought they were just like little clusters of stars, and he was able to determine like, whoa, these are way farther away. And what he did, essentially he looked at light. And so, because anything that we see in a telescope is basically light, and he looked at what was going on with that light. And so essentially, he was looking at it and he saw that it was really, really red shifted. Now, if you're not a scientist, you may not know what that means, but you all intuitively understand it. You guys ever heard a race car go by you, or like on a TV or something? Okay, so it's coming towards you. What does it sound like? Like, and what happens when it passes you? You hear that? Sound goes down. Okay. What happens is, as it's coming towards you, the sound waves are compressed. So essentially, the car is pushing. So here's, I'm going to draw a car. It's going to be really great. Okay. There's a spoiler. Yeah. Okay. So it's going, and what it does is it's got these light waves, and they're being compressed. You're getting really tight. And what we understand in our ears is a compressed sound wave makes a higher pitch. So that's why it sounds high coming toward us. And then it passes us, and when it passes us, the sound waves are going away from us, and what that does is it stretches them out, which is why the sound seems to be lower when it passes, because the sound waves get stretched out. It's going away as it's emitting those sound waves. Does that make sense? Light is also a wave. If there's something emitting light coming toward us, it's going to have a higher, call this amplitude. That's the math term for height or wave, in a shorter period. That's how long it takes to repeat. Okay? When an object emitting light is going away from us, that gets stretched out. Higher wavelengths appear blue into our telescopes. Lower wavelengths appear red. You've heard of infrared radiation? That's light that's been stretched out so far we can't see it anymore. It's lower wavelength than red. Okay? And what we saw and what Hubble noticed is that every single galaxy was redshifted. Every single one. I was like, whoa, what's going on? And he looked out and he saw all these clusters that we thought were in our own galaxy, and they're all different galaxies, and every single one is redshifted. And the ones that appeared smaller were going away faster than the other things. And we noticed that this universe is getting bigger and bigger. I was going to bring a balloon today, and for some reason, poop and everything distracted me from that. But what I was going to do, and so you're going to have to use your imagination. Maybe I'll do it next week just for fun. But I was going to put a bunch of dots on a big balloon. So can you imagine that?
Yeah.
I was going to blow up the balloon. And all those dots, every single one of them is getting farther apart from every other dot. That's essentially a picture of what Edwin Hubble's noticed. He saw everything is retreating away from us. That's how everything can suddenly be going away at the same time. Another good example some people use is like, imagine baking raisin bread. Anybody bake raisin bread in here ever? I love homemade bread. It's my favorite thing. You put a bunch of raisins in there and you bake it. What happens to the bread? It gets bigger, right? All those little raisins get farther apart from each other. And that's the picture of our universe. And so Edwin, he was like, wait a minute. If it's getting bigger, in the past it was smaller, right? That balloon at some point was less inflated than it was today. And a bunch of scientists started thinking about this problem. And they realized a startling conclusion. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Oh, wait, what's happening? At some point, you can't get any smaller. What happens then? And what we came to this conclusion was that it got really small. I mean, the universe at one point would have been smaller than that. The whole universe, at least the observable universe that we can see, would have been smaller than that. Yeah. And this is when it's just the tiniest fraction of a second old. And realize if we go back any farther, then we're left with the unmistakable conclusion that there was a time zero. There was a beginning to the number line. It doesn't go on forever. We can only rewind so far, and we get to a starting point. In fact, Stephen Hawking was the guy who finally figured this out. And he realized at some point there wasn't any matter, like there wasn't any space, there wasn't any energy, and there wasn't any time. And he's like, that's a problem. Because that means that the universe came out of nothing. What does that sound like? When something came out of nothing?
And you compare it to
God
Horizon
created
Freedom.
it.
Sounds like God created. The philosophical term we use is ex nihilo. Out of nothing. That's the way we talk about faith, that God created out of nothing. He didn't like repurpose some stuff he had lying around. It wasn't like a giant Lego set. He's like, I want to build the best spaceship ever out of my Legos. I like to build spaceships when I was a kid. Do you like to build spaceships out of your Legos?
Nope.
Okay. He wasn't like repurposing. He just like created the Legos from scratch. Created the universe from scratch out of nothing. And that's what we saw. And that's kind of what Stephen Hawking, he spent the rest of his life trying to disprove this. And with only moderate degrees of success, which we'll talk about later tomorrow, which essentially is your question. How is it that they could discover, like atheists could discover this, and then still not believe in God? That was essentially your question. And that's a great question. And we will talk about the reasons that they have to justify why they maybe don't believe in God still. Okay. But a couple of possibilities, and just to give you a preview of what we'll talk about next time. Already talked about this. We'll talk about this tomorrow, next time. But 13.8 billion years ago, we were around the equations. Cool, Stephen Hawking did it. The best example that we think, or that scientists think happened is something called inflation. And that's going to answer all of your questions and totally explain away God. It's totally going to work, I promise. Okay? Basically, we know what happened to the universe 10 to the negative 32 seconds after the Big Bang. Now, some of you see those numbers and you're just like, again, your brain just like melts into dust and you see the fraction monster tasting you with an axe. It's not as scary as you think. The 10 power is called scientific notation. It's really nice. Scientific notation is pretty cool because, and we'll talk more about the math either, but like, I'm going to put like a little number here. 10 to some power. Power means you multiply a number by itself. So if I put 5 here, what that is this is a number with 5 zeros. Oops, 100,000. Cool. That's all it means. Okay? So it's 10 times itself 5 times, that's 100,000. A negative exponent is sort of weird, but it's the opposite of multiplying a number by itself, which would be...
Dividing.
Nice. You should teach this class. Okay? It's a number dividing by itself. So we end up with a number that's 1 over 10 to some number. So you have this really small fraction. Right? 10 to the first power, that's 0.1. 10 over 2 would be 0.02. And all this means, again, this is the same as 10 to the negative 2. So if you have a negative exponent, something divided by that number.
0.01.
Okay? Thank you. I never make mistakes in my math class either. Yeah, so 0.01. Thank you. I tell my students, I did that on purpose to teach you to check your own work. Okay? Right? So they're like, whatever, Calbeck. You don't really know any math. And you're like, you're not wrong. Okay. No, I do know a little bit of math. Okay? What we see here is 10 to the negative 32. So I want you to imagine a part of a second that has 32 zeros, and then a 1 at the end. Okay, to put this is really, really like, our brains can't even comprehend that, so I'm going to put it into perspective just a little bit. You guys know about atoms?
Yeah.
They're really small.
Yeah.
Okay? How many atoms do you suppose are in my body?
Billions.
And the answer is more than last year. Okay? There's about 10 to the 29 atoms in my body. Give or take. Okay? So imagine taking a second, 1 second, and splitting it up into that many pieces. And then multiply that number by 1,000.
Oh.
And that's how big that is. So we know what happened to the universe until that point, and then physics kind of breaks down. And so we're pretty sure we know that it got really small, and yeah, anyway. We know the Big Bang happened, let's put it that way. And so just a couple of brief counter-arguments. One that's brought up occasionally, not taken seriously by most scientists, is that there's an infinite division of space. So I can always get smaller. I can always divide. I can always add another number to that 10. I can always make it smaller and smaller, which we do in math. So you do graph an exponential graph, so which hopefully your housing value would be an exponential graph. Okay, you bought it at a certain value and it's doing this over time. But if you rewind back in time, your house is worth less and less. So you see this kind of shape here. But no matter how far you rewind back in time, you don't ever actually get to zero value. Maybe when your parents were there, they could buy it for a nickel. But at some point, it was always worth something. And the idea is that the universe would be the same. You can always make it smaller and smaller and smaller, backwards into infinity. And so it still doesn't need to start. It was always growing infinitely. Most scientists reject this idea because there isn't really good evidence for it. We watch it, we can trace it back to 10 to the 32 seconds, and if we look back one more, it looks like there was nothing. And we're pretty sure that's what happened. So this backwards infinity isn't really supported by most scientists. They think that's not really a good argument. Another argument is called the Anthropic Principle, which I personally hate, and you probably will too. I don't think it's logically consistent, but it says, basically, we don't need to explain the universe because we're in one. It clearly happened, so why do we need to explain it? You're here experiencing the universe, so there is one. Why do we need to explain it? Yeah. I don't think it's a great argument. I don't think it's logically very consistent. So the big and most important one that every scientist that is an atheist is forced to believe is this. You have to believe in a multiverse, meaning that there is more than one universe. That somehow, and I'm going to just say some stuff, we'll explain this next week, but this is literally what's believed, is that the universe is made of an internal inflaton field that spontaneously generates universes. I'm just going to ask you real quick to analyze that supposition for a minute. Is it possible for us to go and scientifically look at another universe? Can we measure another universe?
No.
Have you been to one?
No.
I'm kind of been stuck in this one. So we can't actually see one. We can't test one. We have absolutely no evidence whatsoever to support that there is any of them. So therefore there are some?
Faith.
Well, yeah, that's the point, right? So the question is, who has the faith here? The person who doesn't believe in God or the person who does?
No.
And I think that it takes far more faith to believe there isn't one, because you're forced to believe this situation. We'll dive into this in detail. There's a whole mathematical construct that explains how this supposedly works.
Is it a what? Interferon?
Inflaton field.
Inflaton.
Comes from the word inflation. They decided to make it into a quantum field. We'll talk about that next time. Okay? The inflaton field, if it sounds dumb, you're not wrong. It does sound dumb. So again, I'm left with the consequence. Okay, what makes more sense? Should I use what I can directly observe and measure and see and test? And that's our universe that goes backwards. It seems to appear out of nothing. Or does it make more sense that there is this mysterious universe-generating field that I can't measure, detect, and that's what made us?
So you're saying the scientists are reverting to the God of the cows.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And I believe that this science speaks for itself. So, and again, we'll talk way more about this next time. and exactly why scientists think that. Yeah, and tell me your name.
Peter,
Peter, what's up?
so next time we are also going to address or explain where they think the field came from?
Yes.
Because it
Well,
seems like it's just kicking the can.
It is, but here's what they say. That the field itself is the eternal things. Remember, we don't need to explain something that's infinite and eternal. So they would say that that field is eternal. So they don't need to explain it.
And because we can't see it, measure it, or do anything with it, there's no way to prove or disprove
Correct.
that it is or is not eternal.
Correct. There is some really, really small and subtle evidence that suggests there might be something like that. I think the evidence for God is far stronger. And again, I'll show you the best arguments for and against. I'll show you what they think is another universe colliding into ours. That's a fun one. So we'll talk about all those things. But I think you summarized really well. So, great question. Anybody else have a question on that? Okay. So I think this is a fun summary of the two. That's actually a really, it's not really what atheists believe, but it's really funny, so I put it up there. Okay. I just want to give you a word of caution on this from somebody who's been dived into this for 20-something years. You will not convince someone into the kingdom of God. I'm hoping this already is feeling very persuasive to you, that you see there's direct evidence that this universe came from something that was created, came from something that wasn't in the universe, right? I'm hoping that that's really persuasive to you. And this is actually what persuaded me to realize that atheism doesn't make sense. This whole concept of Big Bang. I was studying antimatter, which sounds like a Star Trek thing, but it's actually real. Antimatter is just like the exact opposite of regular matter. So an electron has a negative charge. Antimatter version of an electron has a positive charge. And they cancel each other out. They literally, when they meet, they explode and there's no matter left. It's not little pieces. Like we think of stuff blowing up and it's made into little pieces. When antimatter and matter collide, they create literally nothing other than light. There is no matter left. It's a complete conversion from matter to energy. And I was like, wow, you can turn something into nothing? That's so cool. Wait, how do you turn nothing into something? And you can't. It doesn't make any sense. So I found it incredibly persuasive when looking at it honestly. You will not convince anyone into the kingdom of God. So please, just for your sake, for the sake of the relationships, for the sake of your own sanity, don't sit there and try to argue someone, reason them into faith. You're not going to get there. Because people like to be right. They don't want truth. They want to be right. In fact, all of us in here have probably come across that sometime in the last year where you haven't wanted to look at some argument from someone because you wanted to be right. I hope that you can empathize a little bit with that and understand that you're not going to convince anyone. And I'm not going to try to convince anyone that's watching this online either. I want you to look at the argument, look at the evidence, and you make the decision. Try to get out of your own head, your own bias and presuppositions, and look at it as neutrally as possible. If you do want to talk with someone about this, the best way is to ask questions, to listen, to hear their perspective. In short, be a Christian to them. Okay, people can think differently than us, and it's okay. Not everyone believes perfectly right away. Not everyone knows all the facts right away. I didn't know all these. I'm going to learn more. I've taught this class now 3 times at this church, and I continue to learn more every time. And I add to my knowledge and what I teach you. I'm not taking this from any curriculum or anything. This is all stuff that I've created and compiled together for you. So my only caution is just understand that's how people are. We all are. We want to be right. We don't want to know the truth. And if you can go into that with empathy into a conversation, I think you'll have a lot more success if you ask questions and you're kind than if you try to browbeat somebody like, how can you not understand this? You moron! Right? Because if we look back at those early memes, that's what all the atheists are saying about us. Don't be better than that. Be Jesus to other people, even in talking about something that seems not necessarily like about Jesus. But it is, because Jesus is the truth, remember. So all this is part of the faith. And so try to act like a Christian in all the other ways when you're talking about this too. And that's my encouragement to you. This is a verse that I have really taken to heart. I had learned this the hard way, actually. But in your heart set apart Christ as Lord. Be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you. And give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. All right? Man, I've had some really, really hard conversations where I thought I could argue somebody, and they just stubbornly refused to convert. I couldn't explain why. And I was like, how could you not see this? It's so obvious. God clearly exists. Jesus is true. What's wrong with you? And it turned out all I did in that was I didn't get him to the kingdom. I broke the relationship. I broke the relationship. And I'm glad God convicted me in each of those cases that's happened, and I apologized and was able to restore the relationship. And interestingly, it was in the apology that ended up allowing the other person to come to know faith. Not any of my arguments. Okay? Just be aware of that if you have these conversations. I would also encourage you, invite somebody here. If you have somebody that's talking, it's like, hey, we're having this class in my church. I know it's weird, it's a church, and you probably don't want to come to service afterwards. Don't have to. Come, ask your questions of Robert, because I don't actually know the answers to the ones you're asking. That's okay to say. If you ask a question I don't know, I'm going to tell you I don't know. Bring him here, let him ask me, and if I don't know, I'm going to tell them that too. And we'll find out the answers together, because I believe God's big enough for our questions, and big enough to give us answers. Okay, I need to let you guys go, because church is going to start in a little bit. Some of you have to volunteer. But I would like to close in prayer. Again, if anybody out there is not a Christian yet, feel free to turn off the video. But I would encourage you just to listen, because we don't believe in this force. We believe in a person. And people can listen and interact with us. So I think that's a really cool piece of this as well. So, Lord, thank you for today. I'm so grateful for everyone here. I'm thankful for their questions. I'm thankful for their struggles. I'm thankful that all of us are here trying to find truth, because ultimately, if we look for truth, what we're going to find is your Son, Jesus. Please help us to find the truth. Help us to find your Son. And give us the grace to have good conversations with people. And help us to try to be honest and gentle and respectful and not try to be right. Help us to be loving. Be with us as we go. Please inspire and cultivate curiosity in our minds. And guide us as we go. Pray this through your powerful name. Amen. Okay. Here's a quick schedule for what we're going to be talking about. So today we talked about origins of Big Bang. We're going to be delving into that much, much farther. We're going to talk about something called fine-tuning of the universe, and we're going to look at the best counter-arguments to the Big Bang and the design that we see in the cosmos. We're going to spend a month or more on evolution and biology. There's so much good stuff there. It is really, really fascinating, and I hope that you can join us for those. Once we get through that, again, we're going very general. Is there a God? Is there not? What kind of God is there? Oh, it's a God that wanted to create creatures. That's cool. Wanted to make something that's hospitable for life. We're going to dive into history as well. We're going to take a look at week 9. We're going to look at archaeology in the Bible. What does history say? Not necessarily just the Bible's history, but can we see, secular history? What does that say about God and His interaction with His people? And we're going to talk about philosophical questions if we have time at the end. Philosophical questions I find are the biggest issues, barriers for people with faith. Things like, if God is so good, why is there evil in the world? Why did my mom die of cancer? Okay, we're going to talk about those things. Again, we're going to deal with them head on. We're not going to candy coat those at all. And then in week 12, I said wrap up in conclusions. Basically, it's like, I don't know if we're going to finish each lesson each week, so I have a little buffer week. Okay? But if you have questions, please, and I encourage you to ask them. If you didn't write down your email on the sign-up sheet, I'd really love to get that so that I can send you resources and other things too. Feel free to invite your friends to this or shoot me emails if you have any questions. All right? That's it for today. Thank you so much for coming. And again, we're going to get deeper next week. We're gonna jump right into some really crazy stuff. It's gonna be fun. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah.